On recent battlefields, there was a rumor about a madman with soulless eyes who disappeared after every battle to find the next one. Everyone felt he was a strange person, a mercenary who cared nothing for his own life. The madman's mouth constantly mumbled that he had been reborn. The underworld said he always appeared in battles related to the Empire, and people also said he didn't fight for money, but for personal vengeance. According to rumors, this madman was actually the prince of a kingdom that had been destroyed. Self-destruction was the best answer he could think of. The third prince of Bryle, Bryle. Bryle thought that he himself had destroyed his own kingdom with his own hands, remembering what happened 10 years ago at the casino in the name of the sinner, the sole survivor of that fallen kingdom. Third Prince Bryle, unaware of the destruction his own hands would bring to the kingdom, laughed and chatted happily because that day he was lucky and won many games. Royal Mage Hernando asked in amazement how he always won so strangely. Yuri waved his hand and said it was just luck, then asked why everyone was standing up instead of playing a few more rounds. He excitedly raised his hand to signal that this time he would bet double. Hernando whispered in his ear to leave. If they stayed here any longer, they would be late for the appointment. Suddenly, someone kicked his chair and stood up, shouting that they were being nice. Why didn't they know their place and leave? The person next to him asked if he thought they didn't know he was using petty tricks to win. How ridiculous. Yuri stood up angrily and cursed. What petty tricks? He asked who they thought he was. The person opposite replied that looking at his behavior, he was clearly not nobility. Was he the king of this country or something? Another one kicked the table and mocked King. If he really was royalty, he wouldn't let him leave so easily. The story went on as they gathered and started cursing the royal family, saying they were all useless, like father like son. From the beginning, what could a family that only knew how to swing swords possibly do? Yuri flipped the card table and told the three of them to listen carefully. He was the third prince of Bryle, Bryle. He smiled friendly but cracked his knuckles and declared that today would be their day of rebirth. As a result, the appointment with the imperial princess was delayed. Yuri explained he was late because his father had an urgent meeting. Could she forgive him this time? Catherine asked if he thought he was the only one who had difficulty arranging time. She continued asking if he knew how far she had traveled, how many watchful eyes she had to avoid to get here. Yuri said he understood but asked her to sympathize with his situation. Moreover, because his father was currently away from his position, he had to be careful for a while, and actually he wasn't even allowed to tell this to anyone. Catherine smiled and said so she was just anyone in his eyes. She threw the necklace on the ground and said if he didn't trust her, then why did he give her this? Why not give it to some woman he actually trusted? Catherine turned away and said not to contact her until she initiated it herself. Yuri called after her named Catherine. He didn't know how to make up for this mistake. From a dark corner of the street, the actions and words of both people were observed by a third party. From that day on, the already fragile relationship between Bryle and the Empire reached its final limit. The simple provocations from the Empire began to exceed boundaries, and the conflict between the two countries became uncontrollable. Until one day it reached the limit and the Empire truly invaded Bryle's territory. Innocent people screamed and fled. Yuri urgently commanded to notify all citizens near the castle to evacuate immediately. Looking at the castle burning in a sea of flames, Yuri realized that the war with the Empire had officially begun. After many eras passed and countless people had sacrificed, the war showed no signs of stopping. Joshua was the one who accompanied Yuri through countless battles, but at this moment he told him to evacuate immediately. Reinforcements hadn't arrived in time. The strongest force of Bryle, what the people called the strongest on the continent, just because of Fior Bryle's absence. The scales of war gradually tipped toward the Empire. At first, Yuri just called it a coincidence and ignored it. Perhaps he was denying the reality he didn't want to believe was true. However, when Yuri recalled the life and death battles he had been through, and when reason gradually returned, he could only come to one conclusion. Catherine was the traitor, the only one who knew Bryle's secret. The time when his father left Bryle was exactly when the Empire began its cruel invasion. Yuri had hoped that this strange coincidence was just his paranoia, but the reply to the letter he had struggled so hard to send to Catherine was only an apology. Holding the letter in his hands, Yuri felt nothing but despair. At the same time, the Imperial forces also found Yuri's hiding place. If they just captured him, then Bryle would be finished. Yuri picked up his sword ready to fight, asking himself why this never ended. No matter how strong he was alone, he couldn't make up for the numbers of an entire enemy force. Yuri resisted, cursing "Damn it. Was this really his end?" Finally, thanks to Roland arriving in time to rescue him by sacrificing his life, he begged the prince to survive no matter what. Yuri wanted to rush forward to save him, but was pulled back by soldiers reminding him he couldn't. "Please, Prince, run away quickly. If anything happened to him, then Bryle would have no future." Several soldiers about to collapse shouted for Yuri to hurry up. "Run away, Prince." Yuri gritted his teeth and, for the sake of the bigger picture, held himself back from charging forward, retreating step by step. The Imperial forces saw this and shouted that Prince Bryle was running away. "Capture him quickly." They chased him relentlessly. Yuri hid in an old warehouse, thinking he couldn't keep hiding here forever. Somehow he had to break through their encirclement and plan for the future. Yuri worried about how his father was doing, though he didn't want to accept it. The fact that his father still hadn't returned meant he had been killed by the Empire. Yuri thought if he died here in this warehouse now, Bryle would have no future. He knelt on the ground and told an unfamiliar enemy general that if he died here, Bryle would be completely unable to resist anymore. He grieved for the knights of Bryle who had sacrificed themselves for him. The man spoke, saying what he wanted to say was an apology. He wouldn't explain at length, but affirmed that the crimes committed by the Empire would be paid for. Soon the Imperial soldiers would flood into this place, so he should go. Yuri received the offer from his opponent and found a way to escape. In his head repeated the thought that no matter what he had to survive, had to live to restore Bryle and take revenge on the Empire. But later he realized his ideals were just naive arrogance. Reality was crueler than expected. Everyone died. Yuri asked himself what their blood was shed for after all. Now he couldn't even find a reason to justify it. Now he only held a sword to punish himself. Yuri was always pessimistic that one day someone would appear, the one who would end this life of his. The person facing him now looked down at him and asked, "People say you're looking for a place to die?" The person continued, "So the reason you rushed into the most dangerous battlefields, recklessly charging without regard for life or death, was just to rest." The man began to reproach him, asking if self-destruction was the best answer he could think of. He was truly selfish to the core. Even death was too good a reward for someone like him. Yuri replied that sounded funny, while the man's eyes looked like he wanted to kill him immediately. Just end it. Yuri thought to himself that anyone who knew about his past should have been dead by now. The man called out Yuri Bryle, third prince. All of this was because of him. All tragedies were caused by him alone. Yuri suspiciously asked if it was Roland. This voice was definitely his, but hadn't he died before? In Yuri's head was a chaotic mess of reasons why the kingdom of Bryle collapsed due to the Empire's cheap schemes. The oath and honor of the Flander family, who were always loyal to the royal family, and both his dignity and faith, all had shattered. Yuri, one who had died and now returned as a vengeful ghost, only to question the mistakes of his past self. Yuri cursed Dana. He thought that after dying his heart would feel a little lighter. The feeling of guilt still weighed heavily on his shoulders until the last minute of his life. Strangely, his father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him that the heir of Bryle never abandons honor even in death. In Yuri's ears rang his father's voice asking if he was okay. He hadn't woken up for 3 days. Yuri's mind was in turmoil as he sat up from bed, looked at his father and blurted out, "So father also fell into hell." He could understand why he himself had to go to hell, but how could his father? Fior Bryle looked at his son confused and asked what? Then he grabbed his father's hand. Yuri said to someone who always talked about honor, yet his father's life was so careless. Before the sentence was finished, Fior hit him hard on the head, scolding what was he saying. Yuri had a big bump appear on his head. He complained that even in hell, his father's habit of using his hands hadn't changed. He told his father to repent, then just remembered and wondered why the bad people weren't here. He thought if this really was hell, then there should be sinners and the terrifying flames of purgatory. There should also be demons that should be torturing and mocking him. Yuri looked at the scene before his eyes, still showing the images of his father and 2 brothers. To avoid this reality, he chose to continue fainting. At first, he thought it was a dream or a long memory, but no matter how many times he tried, he couldn't wake up. The world wouldn't end. Instead, old scenarios buried deep in memory kept repeating, and he couldn't help but acknowledge the truth that he had returned to the past, back to the spring when he was 13 years old. Ina came to call the third prince to wake up and start sword training. He sat up from bed and asked Ina to prepare bathing clothes. She smiled and asked the prince to calm down first. She would prepare water for washing his face. In Yuri's mind flashed the image of Ina's sacrifice in his previous life. The unreal feeling made him a bit confused, so he asked her to slap his face. Ina stood still as if afraid she heard wrong. Wasn't this an act of treason? Yuri confirmed that since he was asking her to do it, it definitely wasn't treason. As a result, that day Yuri went to sword training with a swollen face. He forgot that Ina was someone with terrifying strength. Everyone saw it and gossiped about the handprint on his face, but no one bothered to apply medicine for him. Yuri complained that even sword instructor Bernard didn't bother to ask him anything about his cheek. The more he observed, the more Yuri realized there were many problems. For example, Bernard was simply sparring with him. He didn't even correct his posture properly. He calculated when did he start teaching only through sparring. It seemed to be after the time Bernard met Fior to report that he was a natural genius in intelligence, but unfortunately, he sighed and added that if the prince was a little more sincere, he could have been a blessing for Bryle. Yuri confirmed his speculation. It was definitely from that point. In the end, he could only spar because he refused to cooperate during training session. After hearing that he was becoming lazier instead of trying harder, he also quietly changed his teaching method. Today, after being reborn, Yuri looked Bernard straight in the eye and asked him from today to teach him seriously. He also promised him that from today he himself would also study seriously. Bernard was a bit stunned after hearing this. He smiled, not knowing what suddenly influenced him, but he accepted this proposal. Bernard controlled his aura around the sword blade. From now on he would be truly trained. Yuri saw the change in power and got a bit panicked, shouting wait, then thought again. Before Bernard came here, he was known by the nickname Sword Demon. After a serious training session, Yuri lay exhausted on the ground breathing. He thought so this was what proper training under Sword Demon Bernard was like. If he didn't have the experience of a mercenary from his previous life, things would have been much worse. He raised his hand to block the sunlight and thought although it was a bit tiring, at this rate his skills would improve quickly. Throughout today's training, Bernard had blocked all his attacks. At the same time, Bernard was also silently evaluating the third prince, asking himself when had the prince progressed to this level. Just then Enna opened the door and came in to inform him that he needed to stop and go outside. His Majesty was summoning him. From Enna, he learned that it seemed Count Johannes had brought his son. In his mind immediately came the thought that Count Johannes' son was the one who betrayed the kingdom and paved the way for the empire in his previous life. He whispered, "Got Bakvar, that bastard." He looked at Ina, his voice turning cold several degrees as he asked where that bastard was right now. The banquet held by Fior to entertain Count Johannes and his son had all three princes present. The count noticed Yuri and praised that the third prince looked completely different now. He had even gained weight. Fior didn't spare his son's face and directly replied he thought Yuri had taken the wrong medicine or something. Johannes laughed and said if there was such medicine he would also want to give his son a dose. His Majesty politely said wasn't the count's son already smart? Johannes disagreed, saying the boy still had a lot to learn. Throughout the meal, Yuri listened to both sides conversing while staring at Got with bullet-like eyes. His older brother sitting beside him nudged him and asked if he had some issue with that guy. Yuri didn't know how to explain and could only answer yes, he was someone who stabbed him in the back. His brother smiled and asked what was his little brother planning to do, almighty Yuri. Yuri began seriously evaluating his opponent. On the outside he put on an elegant appearance, but inside he was busy trying to please others. Yuri frowned and judged that he hadn't changed at all. When the anger passed, he became more clear-headed and told his brother he wouldn't do anything. In his heart, he began recalculating everything from his previous life. All these things were because of Got. This life he wouldn't let things repeat like before. Thinking back, in his previous life around this time, he had a duel with Got. Yuri seriously considered whether Got chose to betray because he harbored a grudge from that day against him. Indeed, a duel between two children took place afterward. Looking at Got holding the sword in his hand, Yuri spoke up saying all right, he had heard that he was good with a sword. Got replied that he knew a little. The two of them would have a match. Yuri cut him off saying the kingdom didn't need weak knights. Got didn't understand what he meant by weak, when he wasn't even an official knight yet. Yuri pointed his sword at him and loudly reminded him that wasn't he about to become a knight serving this kingdom. Got couldn't keep up with the conversation and stammered that yes, that was right. This was exactly what Yuri was waiting for to propose a duel, and before waiting for the other party to agree he grabbed his weapon and charged. Got used his sword and the strength of his whole body to block his blade, not forgetting to criticize that sneak attacking was truly a cowardly act. Got was hit in the face quite hard by the wooden stick in Yuri's hand. He angrily shouted, "Third Prince, please maintain the spirit of a knight." After hearing him say this, Yuri also dropped the weapon in his hand to the ground before the stunned opponent. Yuri's second surprise attack caused the weapon in Got's hand to fall out. He fell backward in pain. Got hadn't gotten up yet when Yuri picked up the stick again and pointed it straight at the person lying below. He calculated in silence. In his previous life, Got had used his father's glory to sell information to the Empire. Suddenly, a compliment came out of Yuri's mouth, saying Got's father was an excellent count and a respectable knight. He asked what he thought those titles existed for. What were they used for? Yuri knew this guy just wanted to survive. This time he would help him stand firm in Bryle. He spoke up again, asking if this question was too difficult to answer. Got, still just a real child now, answered that he didn't understand what the third prince meant. Yuri thought he wouldn't allow any knight to have such thinking, including himself. Yuri decided to ask his opponent once more why his father was a count and who gave him that title. He grabbed the other's hand and pulled him up, whispering to try to understand the nature of the situation from now on. He added another request to think about what he had said right here. Got didn't know what Yuri's intention was, couldn't answer those questions either, but still answered clearly. After waking up once, Yuri utilized all the time he had to implement a plan to save the kingdom from the tragedy of his previous life. The first thing he did was visit the knight's training grounds. Rosso smiled and welcomed the third prince, asking what brought him here. Yuri smiled friendly and waved his hand, saying he came to see if everyone was doing well. Rosso respectfully smiled and replied that they still weren't as good as the prince, but everyone was trying their best to train. Yuri stood seriously from above, observing everyone's training while evaluating. Everyone seemed to be training very enthusiastically. Suddenly he spoke up asking where Durand was. Rosso paused for a moment thinking about the name the prince just mentioned and asked if he meant the newcomer, then pointed to a corner indicating he was over there. Yuri stood still, resting his chin on the railing, and observed. Through this action he understood what Bernard meant. Training should be driven by the desire to improve skills, yet he was only doing just enough to get by. He sighed. If this continued, then Gerald would be wasted. Yuri turned to ask Rosso to bring him a wooden sword. He wanted to join the sparring with everyone on the field. Rosso replied he understood, but who did he plan to fight? Yuri smiled and answered with that slippery bastard over there. The prince's appearance made everyone extremely excited. The knights cheered, telling the new soldier good luck, stay alert. Yuri himself also praised that he had heard he was a talented person. He asked if the opponent would like to show him what it would be like when he became a knight. Gerald worried until cold sweat broke out. He quietly answered yes, of course. Yuri smiled satisfied, then he hoped he wouldn't disappoint a third prince, and as soon as he finished speaking he charged forward to attack without giving his opponent time to prepare. Gerald was attacked suddenly, but showed no expression, properly using his sword to dodge the attack. Yuri praised that as he thought, Gerald was indeed a capable person with no unnecessary movement. Everyone started a new round of cheering. Someone loudly shouted to cheer for the prince. Rosso squinted, watching the movements of the two people on the field, and said the prince was quite good. In his heart he exclaimed no. This was too strange. Rosso could see that the prince's attack timing was almost abnormally stable. Put another way, it was as if the prince was trying to adjust to his own rhythm. Yuri looked at his opponent and smiled, asking if he wasn't happy at all. Was that right? The two swords clashed in the gap, and he smiled, saying this was no different from a play. Now let's fight seriously. Yuri adjusted his strength when swinging the sword, putting Gerald in a difficult position. Gerald didn't expect he could block his attack, as he thought his reflexes were truly extraordinary. Yuri swung his sword at a new speed, making Gerald unable to stay calm anymore. He clicked his tongue as he had originally planned to fight with restraint. He slashed directly with another sword, but Yuri blocked it again, making him curse damn it. It had no effect again. Yuri simultaneously evaluated his opponent. Even with memories from his previous life, Gerald was still a mature knight. He thought he could beat him but had to lower his goal. At least he had to land one hit. With the goal lowered this time, Yuri successfully hit his opponent. Everyone on the field was stunned, asking if that attack really hit Gerald. Everyone cheered that the prince was amazing, asking if he held back. Yuri smiled and answered not at all. Gerald at this moment frowned, thinking it was strange. He was the one attacking, yet somehow he felt like he was being cornered. This feeling was extremely uncomfortable for him, accidentally activating a flow of mana surrounding him. Everyone seeing this scene shouted, asking Gerald if he was crazy. What he unleashed was the mana method, and the person he was facing was the third prince. Yuri stood at close range, looking into Gerald's eyes, telling him to calm down quickly. Seeing him gradually lower his sword, Rosso shouted, scolding him as crazy, then asked if the prince was hurt anywhere. He asked further if this was the prince's first time having a sparring match. Seeing Yuri preparing to continue fighting, he worriedly mentioned the wound on the prince's head. Yuri didn't pay attention to the words around him, untied his wristband to rebandage the wound on his head, and told Gerald to pick up his sword again. He smiled, saying now things were getting interesting. There was no reason to stop. In his fighting style, Gerald realized the third prince was completely different from him, reaching his limit. More accurately, the prince was forcing himself to surpass his own limits. Gerald was influenced by the prince's fighting spirit. He felt the blood in his body boiling. He had never felt like this before, even when sparring with stronger opponents. Looking at each sword stroke Yuri swung, that sharp gaze caused something inside Gerald's body to gradually awaken. Yuri swung his sword without mercy, making him have to lean his whole body to dodge. No matter how hard he tried, his face had already begun to get several wounds, making him curse in pain. Damn it. Gerald once again unleashed his mana power and picked up his sword, seriously regarding Yuri as an opponent. With just the first attack after using mana power, the wooden sword in the prince's hand broke in two. Yuri exhaled and dropped the remaining half of the sword, smiling and saying it was over. He looked at Gerald, still heated up, holding his sword, as if not believing the match had ended. He spoke up to let his opponent know he had just realized something. Seeing the prince extend his hand, Gerald came to his senses and grabbed his opponent's hand, saying he hadn't done very well. In Gerald's heart at this moment, there were still countless tangled thoughts. He knew he had changed a lot after that battle. It was the fierce will and perseverance he had never experienced before. He doubtfully thought, why could such a young prince do this? Yuri observed his opponent for a long time before speaking up, asking what he was doing. Gerald confusedly asked, "Huh?" Yuri smiled and told him what he was thinking about that he held his hand for so long. Seeing his opponent flustered, Yuri jokingly asked if he had made the prince bleed from his head and now just stood there not planning to do anything. Gerald embarrassedly said sorry, then ran away and disappeared. Watching his back, the prince sighed that it was just carelessness. The people upstairs were still cheering that the prince was amazing. After a while, Rosso finally noticed and asked when the captain had arrived. Sand looked at the kid lying on the field and replied he had just arrived a moment ago, his eyes still on the prince as he began to ponder. A few days later, Yuri once again went to find Gerald, asking if his shift had ended. He was surprised when he learned the prince came looking for him, and was even more confused when Yuri told him to follow. There was something to do today. Gerald replied he still had to train. The prince didn't turn back and said it seemed his mind had cleared up quite a bit, and this was all thanks to him, so he owed him a favor. Gerald understood what the prince wanted inside, saying all right. Yuri smiled and praised very good. He noticed he was putting all his strength into his body. There were still many shortcomings, but this was enough for now. Gerald curiously asked where they were going, but Yuri answered just follow along. Yuri smiled and let him know if he felt it was dangerous he would call one more person to come along. He confusedly asked who. The prince stood out and loudly called for Hernando. Hernando the royal mage smiled and asked what the prince called him for. Yuri shared that he needed to leave the palace for a while, calling him to help out. Hernando smiled, wanting to refuse. Although he really wanted to go with the prince, he had some urgent matters to attend to. Seeing his opponent really turning to leave, Yuri stopped him, saying he would clear his gambling debts. Hernando whipped around in amazement, asking really? The prince smiled and said he would return all the money he had lost last time. Seeing his opponent still not believing, Yuri asked if he had ever seen him lie outside of the casino. Unexpectedly, the mage said no, he meant he had never seen the prince outside of a casino at all. Yuri, hearing this, doubted if he was really that kind of person. But anyway, he would still clear his debts, so stop talking and let's go quickly. Hernando reluctantly took out a piece of paper from his person and made a proposal. If that was the case, then he wanted to put it in writing. Yuri darkened his face, doubting if the word of the third prince of Bryle was really only worth that much. He held his forehead and called Gerald to come vouch for him. Unexpectedly, his opponent was too shocked to respond. Yuri reminded him that he was saving the prince, so just come be a witness. Hernando smiled, satisfied. Then the three of them could set off together. He was still curious exactly where the prince wanted to go, bringing along a mage like himself and a knight from the royal guard. Yuri didn't hide anymore and answered to Sword Mountain. From now on, the three of them would raid the dungeon of their ancestor. Hearing such an unrealistic answer made both Gerald and Hernando endlessly surprised. Both answered in unison, huh, as if not believing their ears. Yuri followed his memories from his previous life to find a tunnel beneath the palace. Hernando was someone who had lived here for a very long time, but he had no idea such a passage existed beneath the palace grounds. Gerald, following behind, was also extremely curious and asked the prince what was at the end of this cave. Yuri calmly explained to the two behind him that this passage led to Sword Mountain. Gerald had heard about Sword Mountain before, the place where only legends about the founding ancestor remained. Yuri slowly recalled the events of his previous life. After the Empire conquered Bryle, they discovered a mysterious dungeon inside Sword Mountain. The hidden relic found at Sword Mountain was revealed to be the legacy of the founding ancestor of Bryle. Back then, they had made a big fuss, saying they had excavated the legacy of Bryle's founding ancestor inside. However, this passage for Yuri was nothing but a desperate escape route. For that reason, he couldn't even touch Bryle's legacy. In the end, it fell into the Empire's hands, but now after being reborn, he knew the escape route. Yuri thought in this life, he was moving forward step by step, not toward the past, but toward the future. He would verify everything himself, the legacy left behind by the predecessors of the Bryle family. passing through a dark tunnel. The innermost door opened to reveal a lush green forest. Looking at the scenery before him change, Hernando asked the prince so from now on they were at Sword Mountain. He had another question, and without waiting for Yuri to answer he continued, "Prince, where did you get the key to that door from?" Yuri thought it was carefully hidden in the corner of the study, just like in his previous life. Back then he hadn't known its use, so he had paid the price. It wasn't a very good memory to recall. But these things couldn't be told. He coldly answered, "You don't need to know." Hernando suddenly screamed that it stung. His arm had been scratched by a branch and turned red. Yuri reminded him to be careful. The leaves in this forest were very sharp. Don't let yourself get hurt. Just keep following behind. Hernando's eyes glanced back and forth, stopping on Gerald, and asked what the prince had eaten today. Gerald sighed and answered, "Probably so." Yuri walked a considerable distance and still didn't see the two following, so he scolded, asking if they were going to keep walking or not. Hernando laughed loudly, saying the prince's temperament was still the same. The prince ahead signaled for the two to stop and quietly told them to wait a moment. Ahead was a pack of fierce wolves. They hid behind a large bush and began to observe. Yuri informed the two that wolves usually traveled in packs. Sometimes there were more than what the naked eye could see. Gerald wondered how the prince knew that, hearing the prince answer that he read it in books. This surprised him even more than the fact that he knew about wolves. Yuri, after observing for a while, decided to continue. They hadn't been discovered yet, so just quietly passed through. Just as the prince finished speaking, Hernando's foot in the back stepped on a dry branch, making a sound. He smiled bitterly, about to say sorry, when Gerald pushed him away, shouting, "Be careful." Suddenly a wolf lunged at him, but luckily the knight killed it. Yuri folded his arms and praised Gerald for doing well. He knew that fierce wolf fur was very rough and had applied the appropriate mana method. But unfortunately he had to inform him of some bad news. Their leader was eyeing him now. Gerald applied mana around his sword blade, emitting a blinding blue light. He told the other two not to stray too far from him. Two large wolves targeted Gerald with drool dripping from their mouths, looking extremely eager for their prey. As soon as he moved, they pounced. Gerald dodged the attacks while looking for openings in the two wolves to slash. Hernando praised him, saying he fought well, truly worthy of being the captain of Bryle's royal guard. Yuri also added that's right, he was a capable person, but he still had a long way to go. They stood watching Gerald perform for a long time, until he encountered some difficulty before Yuri intervened. The prince spoke up, telling Hernando it seemed it was time for him to show the skills that his father trusted so much. Hernando, upon hearing the suggestion, used magic to create groups of blazing fire. He replied it seemed the prince really knew how to utilize mages in combat. Gerald was busy fighting and didn't know what was happening until one wolf was pushed back. He then turned around in surprise, asking what happened. None of them expected there would be other monsters on the way besides that wolf pack. Because of this, the time to reach Sword Mountain was extended. Gerald exhaled, saying finally they made it, the peak of Sword Mountain. He looked around, asking the prince if this was really the place. There was absolutely nothing here, let alone any legacy. Yuri answered there was no mistake. This was the place. He thought there should be something here, and began searching around until he saw a sparkling stone half buried in the ground. Gerald caught up and heard Yuri say they had to find a way to get this out of the ground. He turned to call Mage Hernando to come help too. Hernando reluctantly answered that mages shouldn't get their hands hurt, but said so while still coming over to help the two dig until a sword appeared. He observed the sword in Yuri's hands and said it didn't look like it had been buried at all. Rather, it looked like a brand new sword. Yuri observed each detail on the sword and discovered two words meaning sin engraved near the handle, not understanding what it meant. Gerald asked so this sword was the legacy of the founding ancestor. Yuri honestly answered he wasn't sure either. Suddenly, the ground where they stood began to move. Yuri smiled, saying they would probably find out soon. After the ground shook and created a large crack, causing all three to fall into a basement. Yuri was caught by Gerald when landing on the ground. The pain didn't transmit as he had expected. The prince sat up and looked at Gerald, asking if he had protected his body using the mana method. Truly impressive. Hernando, thanks to magic, maintained his standing posture and slowly descended to the ground safely. He was protected by glowing orbs, still in the mood to enjoy the surrounding scenery. He exclaimed that this place was much deeper than he thought. Yuri scolded him, saying he had just ignored the prince's safety and only cared for himself. Hernando covered his mouth, laughing, and explained that it was too urgent at the time to think. A sound coming from inside the dark cave made him frightened. He pointed in that direction, telling the prince to look quickly. Yuri didn't believe this mage's words. He reminded him if he was trying to change the subject, it was useless. Hernando fearfully shouted that it wasn't a lie. There was a ghost. Yuri doubtfully asked what, then went to see for himself. Truly what he was afraid of was a death knight. The distance was still too far for him to determine if the other side was dangerous. He could only tell Gerald to quickly get up and be alert. He sat up from the ground asking where they were. His head was spinning until now it gradually stabilized. Suddenly a Death Knight appeared before them. Gerald panicked, telling the prince to quickly step back. He held his sword and stood in front of the prince, saying he would handle this Death Knight. Yuri evaluated that this guy reacted quite quickly. He began evaluating the newcomer as well. The Death Knight, as the name suggested, was a knight who had returned from death. If a knight died and became a Death Knight, he would be much stronger than one alive. However, Yuri could sense that this person wasn't dangerous. He also told him to retreat, then approached the person himself. Gerald was amazed, asking how the prince knew it wasn't dangerous. Yuri answered just intuition. There was no way the guardian of the ancestors' dungeon would attack descendants of the same Bryle name, those who carried the same bloodline. Seeing the Death Knight raise his sword before the prince made the other two scream in terror. Hernando in that moment could only exclaim that the prince's head had been cut in half. Yuri, hearing this, turned around and scolded him to be more careful with his words. Hernando made excuses, saying hadn't the prince's hair also been split in two. The Death Knight only then spoke up, evaluating Yuri, saying that arrogant expression was exactly like that guy. Yuri confusedly asked which guy. Eric Bryle, the Death Knight answered. Eric Bryle was a name everyone in Bryle knew, a great swordsman who had conquered the entire continent with just one sword, and was also the founder of Bryle, the Kingdom of Knights, and the first king. Yuri came beside the Death Knight and looked up, asking if he was the first person to set foot here. The Death Knight answered yes. If not a descendant of Bryle, then the sword could not be pulled out. Yuri raised the sword high to see it better. Then this was the peerless treasured sword that their ancestor once used. The Death Knight simply replied that he had used it. Seeing the prince's expression change, he confusedly asked why he had that look. Was he looking down on the sword just because he was the one who used it? Yuri let him know he was just feeling guilty for touching something that belonged to someone else. The Death Knight changed the subject, telling the Bryle descendant to state the reason he came here. Yuri seriously looked into those dark red eyes of his opponent, but hadn't had time to give an answer. Yuri sensed the surrounding atmosphere beginning to change. The Death Knight was using the mana method, making his entire body nearly transparent. Only the sword in hand seemed to carry a different color, showing its power. The surrounding scenery began to change into an empty land with only him and a transparent figure. The other person gestured, pointing at his own chest. Yuri, through the opponent's gestures, understood he was using a method of mana, and it was also showing him the basic principles that made up that body. Yuri spoke up, asking if his opponent wanted him to copy its power, even while in combat. The prince smiled bitterly, thinking his ancestor was truly a madman, training someone who had never learned the mana method by throwing them into real combat. He affirmed this could only happen to someone who had lived to a second life like himself. Yuri spread his palm and touched his hand to the ground. A stream of power tore through the earth into his arm, emitting a weak light. He happily looked at the moving light, thinking so that's how it was. He heard his opponent call. Though he still hadn't grasped the full way of fighting, Yuri seriously prepared for a real battle. Yuri held the sword in hand, facing the transparent person before him. In his head, he motivated himself that he must quickly become stronger, because not much longer, the Empire would reveal its ambitions and invade Bryle. Reborn this life, he would do everything to destroy them. He would definitely not repeat the mistakes of last time. Yuri declared that Eric Bryle's swordsmanship, he would make it his own. Each sword stroke, following his words, danced, creating eye-catching rhythms. Gerald was also unconsciously brought into another room. There was no one inside. He held his head, looking around, examining that this was a training room, but strangely there was no one inside at all. He hit his own head to confirm this wasn't a dream. Gerald understood that falling in here must have some reason behind it. He loudly called into the empty space, asking where the other person was hiding. Come out and fight. The other person, upon hearing the call, truly stepped out. When he appeared, the one surprised was Gerald. He didn't expect a doppelganger with an identical appearance to himself would appear. Gerald asked himself if a doppelganger appeared, was this the Death Knight's trial? He spoke up, asking what the opponent's name was. Also Gerald? The other person smiled, telling him to stop resisting his fate. Seeing his confused expression, the opponent continued, saying, wasn't he joining the royal guard just to have a peaceful life? Then stay away from the third prince. He would bring misfortune upon himself if he dared to defy fate. Gerald sighed, knowing that his past self would definitely nod in agreement with this guy, but in his head gradually appeared the image of Yuri. Yuri back then had asked him if he didn't find a normal life boring. The opponent, as if reading his thoughts, spoke up, explaining that all these things were no different from a play. Gerald mocked that he would never understand because he would forever be fake, a copy of someone else. What Gerald had done in the past could no longer be taken back. The present Gerald could now face and tell this copy that always thinking about the final move only distracted the mind. The copy stubbornly disagreed, answering that he was wrong, not letting him continue, and immediately charged with his sword. Gerald evaluated each of his opponent's movements, a step too easy to predict, plus a sword style that emphasized defense, not daring to accept any risks. Through what he had just observed, Gerald acknowledged his past self was indeed such a person. Returning to Yuri's battle, the power from that shadow easily overwhelmed him, but the prince didn't allow himself to fall. Even though he was beaten until he sat on the ground, his hand always kept his sword ready to counterattack when there was a chance. He waited until his opponent revealed an opening, then swung his sword, causing his opponent to continuously retreat. Yuri stood up, gripping the sword tightly in his hand, and sighed. He didn't know how much time had passed. The attack just now on his body was truly somewhat dangerous. If not careful, he could have lost his life easily. Yuri swung his sword to prevent his opponent from approaching while thinking about how to use the mana method appropriately. He was pushed back while silently adding thoughts about how to swing the sword reasonably. Thanks to continuous fighting, he thought the mana on the sword had finally begun to stabilize a bit more. All of Yuri's thoughts were cut off. He exclaimed in amazement when seeing the sword in the shadow's hand gradually cracking into pieces and falling to the ground. Next, the opponent's entire body also began to dissipate with the wind. Until the last second, he still managed to see his opponent waving goodbye to him. Yuri smiled, so his time was up. He closed his eyes and softly whispered thanks into the wind. When he opened his eyes again, the prince had been returned to the cave. He looked around in surprise, not believing his eyes. Could he really return? Looking over and seeing Gerald's dirty face wasn't any different from his own, the prince spoke up, asking if he was okay. Gerald awkwardly scratched his head, saying he was fine. Just then, the Death Knight's voice rang out, letting them know he still existed. He praised the prince, saying it seemed he had just had a beautiful dream. Yuri didn't rush to look at his opponent and asked what just happened. The Death Knight patiently explained once more for the two to hear that was the trial, a test from Eric, something he had left for the heir of Bryle, someone who would one day set foot here. The Death Knight spoke with an extremely serious tone mixed with feelings of respect. These words made Yuri unconsciously remember his previous life, when Sword Mountain had been savagely destroyed by the Empire. Therefore, not a single person from the Bryle family could set foot at this stage. Yuri spoke up, voicing his doubt from throughout the battle with the Death Knight, asking if their ancestor had also used this mana method. The Death Knight answered no. Eric only achieved it in his final years, when he traveled to the Eastern Lands. The Death Knight added that was the entirety of Lord Eric's final legacy, created from all the comprehension he had accumulated. After all the trials, passing the test, the Death Knight declared Prince Yuri was the first heir. Yuri confusedly asked why it was passed down to him this way instead of being handed to the royal family. The Death Knight mysteriously said this dungeon would not open if the time hadn't come. When it opened, that meant the moment to use that power had arrived. The prince, after hearing the explanation, understood even less what the Death Knight's words meant. He asked what exactly was this moment he spoke of. The Death Knight refused this question. He said that wasn't something he could answer. He paused for a moment, then added that he should go find out for himself. Yuri stared intently at the sword, once more asking what the name of this mana method was. The Death Knight answered he could call it Soul Slash. Yuri whispered after him, Soul Slash. At this moment, the Death Knight ordered Yuri to quickly kneel on one knee. He would be the one to pass down the legacy of their predecessors to him, the heir of Bryle. The prince followed his opponent's request, kneeling on one knee with his head bowed. A pair of large hands touched the small head of the third prince, while whispering, "Don't fear your enemies. Act according to your beliefs until the very last moment. Fulfill the duty of one who carries Bryle blood." Throughout the process, Yuri continuously responded to requests from his opponent until a pain transmitted from his head. The Death Knight used stronger force, as if wanting the prince to engrave into his mind what he said. He repeated, "To engrave it in your heart. Bryle people never abandon honor, even in death." The final words before his opponent dissipated reminded Yuri that this was the oath of the Bryle bloodline. The next morning, not until sunlight shone into the room did Ina come in to draw the curtains and call the prince that it was morning. Did Yuri finally wake from bed? Ina worriedly asked if the prince was tired, though she noticed the prince had returned very late. He yawned and answered that last night he had stopped by the royal library for a while. Ina casually asked why the prince suddenly went to the library. Yuri simply explained because he needed to find some record. According to the records found in the library, the royal bloodline once had a description of the founder Eric Bryle, that he had a sibling, a figure who had disappeared from the flow of history, leaving no name because he had abandoned his status. Yuri connected everything encountered inside the cave, then he must be that Death Knight. Yuri glanced at the sword he had just received last night. The nameless sibling of Eric must also be the original owner of this sword. Ina's voice pulled him back to reality. She told the prince to quickly prepare to change clothes. His Majesty had been waiting for him for a long time. Yuri, hearing that his father was waiting, immediately jumped out of bed asking why. Ina answered she didn't know, but this happened after His Majesty met Hernando and then demanded the third prince appear immediately. Yuri, hearing this, immediately understood what was happening. In his head, he began cursing his mother. Last night, Hernando had said that when they returned he would report everything to His Majesty. Yuri at that time had asked if he really had to do that. Hernando firmly affirmed yes because he felt he needed to do so. Returning to the present, Yuri used his hand to support his aching head, thinking it seemed he had reported the entire incident to his father. Though not knowing what to do, Yuri still went alone to find his father. As soon as he saw him, his father spoke up saying his son's matters had all been told by Hernando. He began listing his crimes. Not only did he leave the palace on his own yesterday, but also found the dungeon left by their ancestors inside Sword Mountain. Yuri confirmed before his father that was all there was to it. Fior noticed the new sword in his son's hand and asked if he also found it in the dungeon. He stood up from his chair and came before his son, carefully saying he had seen his son change a lot. He began citing evidence from the maidservant, Bernard, to Sand, and even Hernando had said the same. His Majesty kindly patted his son's head, telling him to speak up. Let him know what had caused his son to change. Hesitating for a long time, Yuri still couldn't speak. His father urged, asking if he didn't want to say. Yuri reluctantly answered it wasn't like that. The king determined to ask to the end, then why was he backing away with such an expression? Yuri read the situation and saw his father clenching his fist. Fior understood his son's meaning and put down the sword in his hand. He told his son since it was like this, then just speak now. Yuri lied without blinking, using an obedient appearance to let his father know that he had dreamed a dream. The terrible thing was that he had committed a serious mistake. Fior was extremely curious about what serious mistake his son was talking about. He asked further what was the sin he had committed in that dream. Yuri bowed his head, arranging appropriate words to answer His Majesty. His sin was that he couldn't save Bryle. The prince recounted the dream to his father. In his dream, Bryle had been swept into a great war and countless innocent people had fallen. Yuri had tried very hard to save it, but he had failed. Yuri told his father the kingdom collapsed and he had fled in shame, ultimately meeting a miserable death. Yuri touched his neck, saying when he woke from the dream, the necklace his mother had given him had also disappeared. Yuri paved the way for Fior by letting him know he thought perhaps that dream was a warning sent by his mother. Fior seriously asked his son what in the dream had he seen that destroyed the kingdom. Yuri considered it was still too early to mention the empire. Moreover, there was also a possibility that the invasion wouldn't happen because he had returned to change the past. Yuri answered his father that he didn't know. It was a dark army he had never known. Fior stood still, thinking for a long time about what his son had recounted. He understood that dream could just be a passing nightmare, or it could also be a warning from Lily. But what made him feel most relieved at this moment was that thanks to the dream his son had corrected himself. Yuri heard the comment from His Majesty. He was stunned, wondering if he was really as his father said. Deep in Yuri's subconscious, what he was doing now was just struggling to be forgiven for the sins he had created in his previous life. Fior suddenly spoke up, saying there was something he wanted to clarify with his son, so he asked him to bring the sword here. Fior Bryle was a genius who had known how to hold a sword since he first learned to walk, a man who carried every title containing the word pioneer. Besides that, Fior was also called by the people as one of the 10 strongest, a title for the strongest people on the continent, and he was considered the strongest among them. To put it more simply, he was the strongest sword master on the continent, a person no one could take lightly. After Yuri brought the sword, the king took him to the training room. He curiously observed his surroundings, as this was also the first time he had stepped into his father's training room. When only the two of them were inside the room, he began to share his thoughts. He originally didn't hold hope that any of his sons would have talent in swordsmanship. Yuri waited for his father to finish before arrogantly speaking up that he thought he was the exception among them. Fior didn't scold his son for being too arrogant or praise what his son had. He simply uttered 2 words: talent. Fior drew his sword, pointing toward his son, and asked according to him what was talent for a swordsman. He began listing things like strength, speed, and reflexes, or outstanding intelligence. He paused for a moment to give his son time to think, then posed another question. If Yuri could possess all of those things, could he become the strongest knight? Yuri silently thought seriously about the king's question, but he couldn't come up with a result himself. The king then spoke up himself, saying no. When the prince heard these 2 words, he opened his eyes wide in amazement, looking at his father. According to Fior's next words, the thing more important than everything humans could display externally was also the thing that could help his son surpass human limits. He emphasized that it even transcended feelings of duty or crisis. Yuri immediately changed his attitude when he saw the aura on his father changing colors. He drew his sword while saying he didn't know what to call this thing anymore. It was like the feeling he had heard a call from the sword. Yuri tensely looked at his father, still gripping the sword tightly in his hand, and asked if what his father said was also like destiny. Fior thought, then answered his son, perhaps so, it could be that. Yuri reflected that in his previous life, he shouldn't have entered the path of swordsmanship, and now finding what was suitable and diligently training, he couldn't answer. Fior, not seeing the prince respond, asked his son how he felt. And the final question for today's meeting was, he asked Yuri if he should take up this sword. He asked further if he could hear the sword calling him. He wanted his son to confirm that even if he had to face death, Yuri was not allowed to put the sword down. Yuri sighed and answered his father that he couldn't see anything at all. Just as the answer was given, the space around Yuri suddenly went dark. Yuri panicked, calling for his father. From within that dark space, he heard someone's voice telling the prince to quickly leave here. From deep inside the burning castle, many people cried for help. They called for Yuri to quickly come save them. The prince at that time still hadn't realized what was happening. He just stood there confused, asking why Bryle was engulfed in flames like this. Someone shouted, saying the 3rd prince was over there. The last prince of Bryle was here. Only when the crowd came closer did Yuri realize it was the Empire's army. Reality and the past intertwined. The extremely real emotions made the prince unable to recognize which moment he was in. He looked at his trembling hands, asking himself if it had returned again, back to the moment when Bryle collapsed. Flames engulfed everywhere, a scene so tragic it couldn't be more suffocating. Yuri still stood in the middle of the blazing fire, waiting for the enemy to come. The leader of the Imperial army directly came alone with his sword to fight the 3rd prince. Yuri fought back with all the strength he had. Just like last time, Bryle's army commander appeared like a savior to save the prince. He told Yuri to run. He would stay behind to block them. Seeing the prince had no intention of leaving, the army commander once again begged the prince to please leave immediately. Yuri stood still in place without reacting. After a while, he finally spoke up, asking if this was all just a dream. He couldn't accept his own failure. Was Bryle ultimately destined to fall in despair? Returning once more, Yuri, with a stronger inner spirit, knew he couldn't possibly defeat this large number of enemies, but he had sworn that he would never fear his enemies again. That was why, when asked to run, the prince chose to stay on the battlefield and pick up his sword to fight once more. At the same time, the Death Knight's voice echoed in Yuri's head, reminding him to act according to what he believed in. Until the very last moment, fulfill the duty of one who bears the Bryle name. With this memory keeping him fired up, Yuri fought the enemy even more bravely with unwavering determination. As he swung his sword, the enemy's blood splattered all over his face, or even taking hits from his opponent still didn't make the 3rd prince falter. Yuri threw himself into the sea of fire, fighting for himself with the noble spirit of the Bryle blood flowing through him. After fighting for a long while, another voice rang in Yuri's head, a provocative voice from the Imperial army. They called for Prince Bryle to stop. Now he was certainly going to die, stop fighting meaninglessly, and just give up. Yuri gritted his teeth, emphasizing each word to let his opponent know that Bryle people never abandon honor, even in death. The 3rd prince used all his remaining strength to once again channel mana around his sword blade and charged toward the enemy. He shouted as if talking to himself in the Death Knight's tone, until the very end, fulfill the duty of one who bears the Bryle name. Yuri's mouth kept continuously repeating that until the very end, he must not forget the duty of one who bears the Bryle name. Fior Bryle came and placed his hand on his son's shoulder, shaking him and calling for him to wake up, asking if Yuri could hear his father's voice. Yuri startled awake and seeing his father immediately cried out, "The Legion!" The Dark Legion had come again. His Majesty patted his son's shoulder to calm him, telling him to calm down. What he saw was just an illusion. Yuri, hearing this, gripped the sword in his hand tightly, thinking so it was just an illusion after all. The king, seeing this sight, sighed. It seemed he had been mistaken. He concluded that the sword in Yuri's hand should be left for him to keep himself. The 3rd prince didn't refuse. He smiled and accepted, as that was also his decision. Looking at his father's expression change in an instant, he didn't understand why he was using that look with him. He secretly laughed that anyone seeing this expression would probably think he was about to turn into a corpse. Yuri smiled brightly, grabbing the king's sleeve, telling him not to worry too much. Father knew he was talented, right? Finally, because of this statement, Fior Bryle was able to let go of the burden in his heart. He showed a gentle smile looking at his son. The next morning, when arriving at the sword training grounds, Yuri was extremely surprised when receiving the proposal to learn the ancestral swordsmanship of Bryle from Bernard. He frowned and asked his opponent if he really wanted him to teach him the ancestral swordsmanship. Bernard pondered thoughtfully. He had truly begun to find it interesting. But Yuri cut him off with an apology, saying this matter was extremely difficult. The prince secretly thought that it was understandable for this refusal anyway, since after all he was the sword demon. Bernard, despite being refused, still hadn't given up, and replied that even if he hadn't completely mastered it, that was fine. This had been in his calculations from the start. Yuri once again interrupted to express his view that Bernard's words were correct, but what he wanted to say was that thing wouldn't help him at all. Yuri spoke while using the sword to channel mana to show him. He added that this swordsmanship was originally won with the mana method. Bernard showed great interest and asked back if both were won. This was the first time he had heard about that. After saying so, he truly carefully studied the light being emitted. According to his understanding, normally the mana method was used to enhance swordsmanship. The third prince closed his eyes, silently agreeing. That was also the reason he said passing it on to him would be somewhat difficult, and anyway, it would never be complete. Bernard thought for a very long time before speaking up, saying, "All right, even if the swordsmanship wasn't complete, that was fine." In return, he would still continue to stay in Bryle. If one could say so, Bernard was an extremely stubborn person. No matter how many times he was rejected, he still stood firm with his decision. He smiled, letting the prince know that even if it was only half, there would definitely still be parts he could understand. Yuri gave up and secretly cursed that it was truly crazy confidence. He smiled again, looking at his opponent, asking so he would still stay in Bryle as promised, right? Bernard answered, "Yes, your highness," then brought out his sword himself, pointing toward him, asking if the prince could demonstrate it. The prince got into ready position as streams of glowing mana surrounded the sword blade in motion. Today he would show him Yuri Bryle's soul slash. Suddenly, at that moment, Bernard spoke up, saying there was one thing he forgot to tell the prince. Actually, from the beginning, he had intended to stay in Bryle. Yuri was provoked to anger with his head about to burst with smoke. He shouted, asking what he had just said. Bernard laughed loudly, raising his sword, asking if the prince wouldn't attack right. Then this old man would strike first. He angrily controlled the sword in his hand, asking his opponent why he only said this now. That evening, when returning to lie on his soft bed, Yuri realized one thing was changing. Into a different future, a Bryle not destroyed because of his mistakes. Although currently no special measures have been taken, Bernard's decision to stay in Bryle was proof of that. Yuri raised his hand up high, looking at it, then whispered that changing the future was once vague and uncertain, but even if it was just bit by bit, he could still be certain that it was changing. The third prince clenched his hand, showing determination. It wouldn't stop here. This time he would definitely prevent the invasion from the Empire. Yuri repeated that he would definitely be able to do it. Ina opened the door and stepped in, saying according to the third prince this time he absolutely must not cause trouble somewhere. Yuri jumped up from bed, asking if she had other things on the schedule. Ina answered that the prince went causing trouble all day, so he didn't even know what she had just mentioned, right? Ina looked at his confused face and decided to say herself that tomorrow he had to attend a meeting. That was also the reason she said so. Yuri looked at her and asked again it was a meeting. The girl answered yes, it was a meeting of the elders. His Majesty had announced this time he would also have to participate, and until now he still hadn't grasped the news. Ina provided more information, letting the third prince know he would have to set off tomorrow morning. She heard that most of the elders would attend. She grabbed Yuri's hand seriously, saying there would be some scary and stubborn people, but he absolutely must not do anything provocative or respond like that. Yuri asked himself if that was what made her worried. He laughed loudly, telling her not to worry. Now he no longer did that anymore. Ina didn't believe the third prince's words and asked again, really, he had promised, right? Yuri really didn't know what to say to this girl. He had promised, so there really was no need to worry. Only when sitting at the meeting table did Yuri acknowledge that Ina's words were correct. Duke Gennard had opposed from the start. He argued that it was wrong for the prince to learn an unverified mana method. Yuri no longer focused on the old man and cast his eyes, evaluating the members of the Elder Council. This was actually a place to discuss the kingdom's governance, but in reality it had long become a place where they aimed at the throne. Yuri now understood why his father never wanted to participate in it. Duke Gennard was still loudly arguing that it would be better to have the prince learn the Bryle method rather than spending time learning such things. Another person disagreed, asking what he meant. What did he mean by unverified method? This was the ancestor's legacy. He asked back the person who just spoke how he could prove it was the ancestor's legacy. The other person lost patience and slammed the table, shouting if he was doubting the prince. Duke Gennard lowered his voice, saying his point was just that being careful was still better. Wasn't it that everyone gathered here was worried about the prince's safety? While everyone was tense, a stranger stood up wanting to give his opinion. Duke Gennard glanced and asked who he was, what was his title. The other person cautiously greeted everyone, then introduced himself as Calclo Arancha. He was a free prince. Duke Gennard scornfully said, just a baron. How dare a lowly person like him attend the Elder Council meeting? He didn't expect Arancha to honestly reply that he also didn't want to come. But what could he do when Count Sator had entrusted this matter to him? Yuri, hearing the name Count Sator, immediately began calculating. He must be the Marquis guarding Bryle's border. True to that title, he was the lord guarding the border, which was the front line. Additionally, he was also famous as a true warrior who had spent his entire life on the battlefield. Sator was famous as someone who completely didn't care about noble affairs. Yuri began to feel curious about what reason made him send someone to attend the Elder Council. Not only Yuri had this question, someone had already stepped ahead and spoke up asking what had happened that made Count Sator send someone to attend the meeting. Arancha didn't spare anyone and spoke straight out that Count Sator wasn't the meticulous type. However, seeing the high-ranking nobles here obsessed with power struggles, drowning in meaningless debates, Arancha emphasized he had understood why the Count sent him here today. He began stating his personal view that the type of mana method actually didn't create much difference on the actual battlefield. Whether it was the Bryle method or the Empire's Heart technique, ultimately it still depended on the person executing it. Arancha cast his eyes toward Yuri, asking how the prince felt. The third prince secretly laughed, evaluating that he was starting to like this guy. But on the outside he still maintained a calm demeanor, answering that as the Prince of Bryle, he truly didn't understand why everyone had to argue about him intending to cultivate the ancestral mana method. The third prince concluded that no matter what everyone said, he would still learn the ancestral mana method. Arancha continued, announcing that now the instinct of this sword-wielding prince had decided to follow the will of the ancestors in that mana method. Then why would unrelated people, without authority, also bearing no responsibility, keep butting in and making noise? Arancha bluntly pointed at the old men's weakness and mocked that usually those desk sitters, who had never swung a sword once in their lives, were the noisiest ones. Duke Gennard was the one with the most opinions since the start of the meeting. Being spoken to like that wasn't pleasant at all. He angrily asked the free prince what nonsense he was saying. Arancha gave a very reasonable excuse, asking for forgiveness. If there was anything disrespectful, he hoped everyone would forgive him. He expressed that he truly couldn't hold back, because every day he had to fight with those ORCs at the border. Arancha changed his tone, saying he had mentioned this before. He asked everyone present if they could tell him, among these people, how many had fought with ORCs. The entire meeting room was silent. No one could give the desired answer. Just as Arancha intended, he continued his presentation, asking if they thought those ORCs cared what type of mana method their opponent used. One person stood up, replying that his words weren't wrong, but even so the prince was still young, so his judgment wouldn't be completely accurate. Arancha immediately cut off his opponent, asking if his meaning was that the prince should tear up and redo the entire mana method. Yuri couldn't stand listening to these old men's opinions anymore, and this time spoke up himself, asking just because he made one wrong decision. If necessary, then he wouldn't have said so, while knowing full well this matter was impossible. Arancha gave his conclusion that anyway, the prince didn't seem to be backing down at all. He posed another sharp question, asking if these old men wanted to force the prince to extract his mana core. The group was so angry their faces turned pale, but couldn't do anything to someone with a tongue like his. Arancha laughed, replying he didn't think everyone would really do that, so arguing now was useless. He looked at Yuri, asking if the prince also thought so, but everyone just sitting here was damaging the prince's mental health. Arancha mocked that it seemed the palace was truly a leisurely place. Duke Gennard slammed the table again, asking what he meant by leisurely. How rude. He started shifting the subject to Sator, asking, hadn't things been very quiet lately after receiving that budget? Arancha for the first time used an ice-cold tone, asking if hundreds of people had to die before it was called not peaceful. He affirmed that he had never heard or looked at the reports about soldiers falling every day. On the very day he left the territory, there were already 4 deaths. Arancha painfully recounted that he had even covered a friend with a burial cloth with his own hands, someone who just that morning was still chatting and having breakfast with him. Arancha used a reverent tone to report to the noble sir that those ORCs never rested. They spent their entire lives fighting and slaughtering. Mentioning the ORCs made Yuri remember that in his previous life around this time, there had been issues between Bryle and Duke Klein. Back then, the ORCs had continuously crossed the border, causing serious losses. Now something had changed in their behavior that Yuri couldn't explain. Currently, they had become more suspicious and gloomy than usual. Yuri suddenly said he understood, then asked what about the situation on Klein's side, making Arantxa unprepared and a bit flustered. He seriously asked again, wasn't the Duchy of Klein's army also stationed there? Arantxa understood the prince's words and replied that their border defense forces had suddenly withdrawn. Yuri continued asking what about the village at that border. Arantxa reported it was completely devastated, the people were killed or taken as slaves. The situation was extremely tragic. Yuri closed his eyes, considering that the timing matched perfectly. Could it be civil war? The prince vaguely asked if it was the Duke's third child behind all of this. Realizing he had said too much, Yuri lightly coughed, saying this was enough for today. He stood up, leaving the table, telling the group to discuss bigger issues. Don't bring up his trivial matters anymore. He suggested they could think about defense against the Duchy of Klein and the ORCs, for example. Stop worrying about a teenage boy going through puberty. That evening, as soon as he returned to his room, Arantxa recounted everything about the third prince to Count Sator. Rumors were spreading that the third prince was very different from before. Arantxa was asked how he felt and replied that his gaze wasn't bad. Sator ordered him to continue monitoring the third prince. He said on the surface he had nothing noteworthy, so should they conduct a background check. After ending the conversation with the Count, Arantxa looked down at the street and silently lamented how peaceful it was. Even though everyday soldiers at the border kept falling, a figure passed by on the street, and though covered by a cloak, Arantxa could recognize it was the third prince. Hernando, walking beside him, quietly said he had snuck out of the palace at his request, and his heart was still pounding. It truly reminded one of the younger years when sneaking out of the palace was routine. Roughly speaking, Hernando had also once been a rebellious youth. Yuri asked how he looked so excited. He could leave the palace on his own anytime. The mage replied if it was just him alone, it would be called strolling. But going with the prince secretly felt like committing treason. He stopped and asked what mischief he was planning to do. The prince rejected this thinking of his. That wouldn't happen. Even if he did something, he wouldn't do it with him. Hernando expressed disappointment. So where exactly were they going? Yuri smiled, letting him know they would go to a casino, the most illegal casino in the capital. Hernando immediately argued back, saying didn't he say he wouldn't do anything bad? Yuri replied that's right, he wasn't. He just needed him to lead him to that place. Seeing he was about to say something else, he cut off his words to speak first. All of this was for Bryle. Hernando opened his eyes wide, looking at the prince, thinking just how much had he prepared. Indeed, he had calculated everything beforehand. He understood what Yuri wanted to convey and happily exclaimed, good. Tonight let's turn that entire casino upside down. In Yuri's previous life, among the people of Bryle, there had been those who made the whole world talk. Among them was the boss who once ruled the underworld and the notorious loan shark. They were giants in the commercial world, leading the entire continent. And the remaining person was the one who beheaded the notorious bosses of the underworld, spreading fear throughout the streets of Bryle. She was a peculiar assassin. And the one she had killed was the best loan shark currently, Goryo, the person now standing to welcome the third prince. Goryo smiled, saying he didn't expect a noble person like him would have business to do with them. It was truly an honor. Yuri laughed, replying it seemed he already knew who he was, while Hernando was still amazed, asking what. Goryo answered the third prince, of course, the king's own mage, and the third prince personally wanted to meet. Though power was limited, didn't there still need to be someone to shoulder the burden? Yuri praised that it was truly an accurate judgment, and he came here truly not to gamble or play. Goryo gestured, inviting the two inside to sit down and talk. Hernando sat down beside Yuri and quietly asked, didn't the prince say he wouldn't gamble? He also hadn't mentioned anything about doing business with him. Yuri didn't answer his question and just told his opponent to be quiet. Goryo, with sharp ears, heard their conversation and spoke up, saying if the prince didn't come here to gamble, then did he come to borrow money? Yuri answered yes. He intended to use the borrowed money as an investment. Goryo probed, meaning the prince was planning to set up a black fund, and because he was borrowing money from him instead of a bank. He asked further, could it be the third prince had such great ambitions? Yuri cut off his opponent, telling him to stop. Interrogating him wasn't his business. He knew he had overstepped and sent his apologies. Yuri sighed, saying it was fine. Anyway, he was the one who needed money. The third prince got straight to the point, talking about the purpose of using the borrowed money to buy Magranja, the spice land of Klein, because he knew sooner or later supply wouldn't meet demand. Goryo evaluated that Magranja was indeed an essential area for processing premium spices, but he was still doubtful whether it was worth investing a huge sum of money there. Yuri understood his opponent's concern and affirmed that would happen soon. Hernando pondered that he had also heard that war had broken out in the Duchy of Klein and ORCs were roaming everywhere, but he didn't think spice prices would rise that much. He looked at Yuri's demeanor and began having different thoughts. Could it be he simply wanted to monopolize regional specialties one step ahead? But the look Yuri gave off was very different from before. Goryo was someone who had done business for a long time and could see that Yuri was acting based on more information than what had been revealed. He seriously told him to decide the amount. As an investor, not a prince, how much money could he give him? Goryo presented a contract paper asking the prince to sign that paper first. Until leaving the casino, Hernando still couldn't believe that Goryo would lend money to the prince, and with such a huge amount too. He spoke up saying this amount was too much, prince. He should have at least said something beforehand. He asked if from the start the prince had no intention of gambling, right? Yuri laughed contemptuously, saying if he told the truth, wouldn't he have taken him directly to his father? The two then moved to the next location. Yuri still had several things to do. He knew actually Magranja was a place that could guarantee profits. The only alchemist who knew the formula, Duke Klein's assistant, would be the first to die in the upcoming war. This was a commodity that could be priced at any amount, at least until a replacement appeared. He couldn't hand this matter over to anyone else. Hernando, following the prince, stopped in front of an extremely run-down house. He exclaimed in shock, asking why this place. Yuri didn't care about the person beside him and knocked on the door, calling Elaine Wood, asking if she was there. The mage stepped forward to stop the prince, saying this matter should definitely be handed to a large merchant guild. A girl opened the door asking who it was. She was Elaine Wood. Yuri introduced himself as the third prince, saying he had work he wanted to ask her to do. Leaving Elaine's merchant guild, Hernando was still in shock, asking Prince had he gone crazy. He affirmed anyone seeing him in this state would say the same. He truly didn't understand why the prince would hand the task of buying Magranja to a merchant guild on the verge of collapse. Only Yuri understood that currently she might just be a struggling merchant, but before long the name Elaine would be famous across the continent as the leader of a merchant guild no one had ever heard of before. And unlike Goryo, who hid behind a facade of trust but was ready to use dirty tricks when cornered, Elaine considered promises to customers as sacred. In her previous life, she might have just been a legendary merchant, but in this life, he would turn her into a legend beyond legend. Hernando tiredly asked if anyway the prince was done now, the whole evening leading him from one surprise to another. Yuri held up one finger, letting him know there was still one last thing. Hernando shouted, chasing after him, "Wait, prince, where else did he want to go?" Just now was the underground loan shark boss, the tycoon merchant, people who were ready to become his allies. Yuri thought now he just needed to go convince one last person. He stopped at a street with many homeless people, guessing the girl he wanted to find was just somewhere around here. His eyes lit up when he found a blue-haired little girl. He then went to greet her. Yuri let the little girl know he was the third prince of Bryle. The girl surprisingly stood up from the group, asking the prince, what would a prince be doing in a place like this? Yuri lowered his eyes, telling his opponent she didn't need to be so guarded against him. He let the little girl know he came near because he thought he could help them with something. Yuri extended his hand, telling Hernando to quickly hand over the money pouch. He trembled, not understanding what the prince's action was meant to do. He received the money pouch and his eyes immediately shifted to a small child hiding behind Asana, asking himself if it was this child. In his previous life, Asana had borrowed a very large sum of money from Goryo just to treat this child's illness. Like many others who borrowed money from Goryo, Asana was also destroyed by him. It was precisely this that pushed this girl onto the path of an assassin and eventually became one of the most notorious killers. Yuri's goal was to prevent that from happening. The prince didn't hesitate to give the entire money pouch to the girl, telling her to use this money to take the child for treatment. Asana received the money pouch, looked at Yuri, and cautiously asked what the prince wanted. Yuri repeated her question, asking what he wanted. She just needed to remember one thing. The person giving her money was the third crowned Prince Yuri Bryle. On the way back, Hernando asked the prince why he gave such a large sum of money to a beggar. Yuri simply answered that was an investment for the future. Tonight, he had successfully established relationships with the people he needed in the future. Yuri calculated that now there was only one more person. He stopped and asked Hernando what he had seen inside the tomb of the founding king. He smiled, giving him an answer he didn't expect. It was gambling. Hernando even detailed telling the prince he had played a game betting his life at the Barthletus casino in the Empire. Yuri found him untrustworthy, so he let this matter go. The prince mentioned today's matters, asking him to keep it secret. The next morning, the king had summoned Hernando. he had heard about last night when he went out with the prince. He asked if he could tell him what happened. Hernando began telling that the third prince had convinced him to leave the palace together. Then both went to a casino, which was the largest casino in the capital. Fior asked for more details, whether the boy gambled there when he went to the casino. Hernando answered yes, the prince did gamble. He mockingly added that he thought the prince was good at gambling, but who knew he couldn't play at all. Yuri had lost all the money he had lent. After that, the prince took money from Goryo and gave it to some old merchant guild. Next, the third prince gave a pile of money to an unknown orphan child. The two had walked around and observed how the people lived. Hernando smiled, praising that the third prince seemed very concerned about how everyone lived their lives. The mage ended the story there, only telling the king about trivial outside matters and truly keeping secret what needed to be kept. The king suddenly asked if he would attend the ball, not expecting Hernando to answer yes. He said people's hearts change. It had been a long time since he had danced. During today's sword training, Yuri pointed at the group of maids, telling Bernard it seemed he was very popular. The girls kept glancing at him. He said it seemed he had to attend the ball. There must be quite a few people waiting. Bernard replied he wasn't very interested. He pulled Yuri back to sword techniques. Anyway, this was the sword technique he had used. This move had no fixed form. Yuri admitted he just moved following the flow. A person who could use the mana method simultaneously with sword techniques, he truly couldn't understand it. Bernard suggested he could observe how he fought in actual combat situations to research. He led on that anyway. The prince was progressing very quickly and was also good at controlling mana. Bernard honestly was quite surprised. He didn't think the prince would be so proficient at controlling mana. Yuri thought he also felt a bit guilty. Everything just happened like that, because he had also tried to erase all traces of the Bryle method he had learned in his previous life. Bernard advised Yuri not to be too hasty. He was truly very worried about him. At this age, having reached this level, but the prince's body still hadn't fully developed. Yuri smiled, telling him not to worry. He would keep everything perfectly balanced. And now, let's continue sparring. Yuri wanted this time to spar with real swords. He needed to get stronger quickly. The third prince also wanted to make a bet with Bernard. If he could land a hit on him, then he had to attend the ball. Bernard refused, then thanked the prince because anyway he would win. Moreover, if he lost, then the third prince would definitely make excuses to cancel the bet. He had no credibility at all. Yuri angrily told him to just wait and see. He would definitely catch him. The result was clearly the third prince couldn't do it. A few days later, on the night of the ball, the princess and prince of the empire visited. Jorg teased his younger sister, saying her eyes still hadn't left the window. Yekaterina smiled brightly, saying it had just been so long since an occasion like this, so she felt excited. She also wanted to meet one more person. Ina was in charge of preparing the ball attire for the third prince. She asked how he felt. Looking at himself in the mirror, Yuri answered it was too flashy. The decorations were too distracting. Please take them all off. Ina said in her eyes it still looked fine. Before, he used to like things even more like that. She truly didn't understand how the prince's aesthetic taste could change so quickly. Waiting until everything was prepared, she reported, then quickly left, but was called back. Yuri asked Ina if she could dance with him. The third prince embarrassedly explained he just wanted to practice dancing before going to the ball, and currently there was no one else to practice with. Ina frowned, asking if it was necessary to do this. Yuri asked back what was that disgusted expression for. Ina, though not wanting to agree, still had to extend her hand. She cautiously told the prince not to step on her feet and make her fall. Yuri pulled her hand and smiled, saying he wasn't going to joke with her. Just follow his feet and it would be fine. Ina then coordinated very smoothly. She playfully asked if the prince was teasing her. Unfortunately, she was also quite good at dancing. She continued asking if the third prince danced often, with whom. She was also quite famous, but had just never danced with anyone before. Yuri silently noted this grudge. Just wait, the height difference wouldn't be a problem anymore. Next, a scene later was just the bickering sounds of the two. Yuri continuously complained that Ina stepped on his feet. Ina laughed, saying it was just a wrong step, just carelessness. At the ball, Yuri didn't expect Count Sator to also appear. After observing for a short while, he truly felt that he was really different from the remaining knights. He still clearly remembered in the previous meeting there was only Baron Arancha. He had never appeared. The first prince walked past Yuri and stopped to get pastries. He teased, asking brother had his eyesight gotten worse. He had started wearing glasses more. The first prince smiled, saying it wasn't to the point where his younger brother needed to worry. At this moment, the second prince of the empire, along with his younger sister, walked straight through the door toward King Fior Bryle. The king took the prince's hand, thanking him for coming here. Jorg replied he was very grateful for this warm reception. He pointed to the girl beside him, introducing that today he came with his younger sister too. Ekaterina lifted her sparkling dress and bowed to greet his majesty. Yuri standing behind, just seeing the girl, his heart immediately shattered into 100 pieces. He pushed away all the painful memories of his previous life, thinking he absolutely couldn't create a close relationship with this girl. This time he wouldn't repeat the mistakes of his previous life, absolutely never. After the greeting, the ball officially began. Yuri watched his older brother easily choose a girl as a dance partner. He secretly praised that was indeed Cedric. He was someone who had never treated anyone badly. The third prince felt this was truly the quality of a benevolent lord. Compared to him, he was nothing at all. He cast his eyes toward Yekaterina, the one who had brought so many terrible things in his previous life. Yuri discovered that the princess was also looking at him, but in this life he no longer had the courage to step forward. Another prince came and extended his hand, inviting Yekaterina to dance. Yuri turned away and secretly cursed Danet, a fated connection destined to end in tragedy. What feelings could he still keep? Just at this moment, Ina happily carried over a tray of cookies and wine. She saw the third prince and asked if he wanted cookies. Yuri took the cookie and thanked Ina. He asked if she felt too tired. Ina laughed loudly, saying no. Compared to cleaning up after someone all day, this was too easy. The third prince angrily told her to stop talking so much and quickly bring more cookies over here. Ina smiled, carrying the empty tray away, reminding the third prince to call whenever he wanted to eat more. Jorg for some reason came looking for Yuri. The third prince recognized the person standing before him was the second prince of the empire. He clearly remembered he was the one who had commanded soldiers to the battlefield on behalf of the king. In front of this cunning person, he needed to be extremely careful. Yuri simply bowed to greet his opponent, letting him know he was the third prince. Yuri, when facing the one who pushed Bryle to destruction, continuously told himself to stay calm. He couldn't openly show hostility toward this person. Jorg came closer, creating pressure on Yuri, then asked if he had just turned 13 this year. After that he laughed loudly, then brushed past Yuri. After walking a distance, he praised that as expected of Fior's son, he also had some talent. The third prince clenched his fist, thinking that for someone who just came to test him, he showed too much dominance. Knowing he was young, but the strength he possessed was truly hard to believe. Yuri secretly cursed they were all a bunch of bastards, both of those people. He hadn't left for long when, whether intentionally or accidentally, he bumped into Ina, causing the wine on her tray to spill all over the ground. He looked at her and blamed her, saying the symbol of the kingdom was truly rude. Ina trembled, apologizing, but the second prince had already drawn his sword from behind, pointing at her, punishing her for committing no small mistake. According to royal law, this was execution. Yuri, standing nearby, became even angrier. He knew well that bastard was deliberately targeting Ina. Jorg repeated his verdict that for someone who offended the royal family, just execution was enough. Fior Bryle couldn't stand still anymore. He stepped forward, asking if he came here to ruin tonight's ball. He showed his firm face, saying if the second prince wanted to see blood, then go back and do it on his own land. Jorg realized he had gone a bit too far and put away his sword, apologizing to the king. He said, "Your Majesty, the Empire and Bryle had respected each other until now." Fior answered yes, but it seemed he didn't respect them. Jorg suddenly mentioned someone's name, asking if the king remembered Ensha. He continued, saying when the king executed a knight of the Empire, the Emperor of the Empire had respected him and didn't demand he take responsibility for that action. Therefore, today's matter wasn't much different from that. The second prince of the Empire believed his action today was protecting the peace and honor of both nations. Yuri knew in the past his father had personally killed a knight of the Empire, but he brought up that matter at this moment, meaning the kingdom's honor was being put on the betting table. Fior was forced into a difficult position and couldn't save Ina. He turned away, saying he didn't want to do this either. Please resolve the issue quickly. Jorg once again picked up his sword, saying there wouldn't be much blood. The third prince knew stopping his action right now was no different from provoking the entire empire. However, in Yuri's head currently was a tangled mess between needs and power, ideals and reality, reason and strength. However, Bryle would never abandon honor, no matter what. And that was also the oath of those who had Bryle blood flowing in them. Yuri went to tell the second prince of the empire that girl was his servant, so her mistake was also his. The third prince just remembered he was also a prince, so he had the right to make a request, asking Jorg to consider. Yuri's head was full of haunting emotions before the past of being a criminal himself, and this life was the sentence he had to bear. That's right, from the beginning he had no right to choose. Yuri asked the second prince to retract the decision to punish her. Instead, please consider a duel. The second prince, upon hearing the request, laughed loudly, saying, "All right, Just now you said your name was Yuri, right? Goryo asked if he could call him directly by name Yuri. He then turned to address His Majesty. The third prince had made a reasonable proposal, so he would accept. Goryo ignored the king's worried expression and asked how he felt. He added that originally he would fight himself, but for honor he would appoint someone to duel. Jorg, acting like someone who thinks of others, told Yuri that because he was young, he would choose the youngest person in the royal guard. After presenting, Jorg bid farewell and left. Yuri quickly ran to help Aina up, patting her back to calm her, telling her to go rest. Ina's eyes full of tears looked at her savior and cried out, "How could she, your highness?" Yuri told her not to worry about him, then also left the party. While going to the hall, he encountered Yekaterina, again seeing unpleasant memories. He turned away, not caring about the princess, also scolding himself for having such damn thoughts. The third prince was blocked by the first prince. Before entering his room, he asked what he was thinking. He honestly told his older brother he couldn't possibly let that guy kill Aina. The first prince exclaimed, saying, "You really are?" He rubbed the head of his little brother, not knowing what to do. Yuri enjoyed this moment. If counting from his previous life, it had been a very long time since he experienced this feeling. The first prince removed his hand from his younger brother's head, asking if he needed any help. He let him know the person he was about to face acted nice, but actually was completely the opposite. He worriedly remembered Jorg's words, saying he wouldn't fight himself, but would choose a young person to substitute. If the two were the same age, then even if an accident happened during the match, it could be explained. Yuri answered he knew what his older brother was worried about. The first prince, seeing his younger brother understood, didn't need to explain anymore. Instead, he would handle everything. Yuri stood straight, refusing the first prince's goodwill, because he was the one who started this, so he would also end it himself. Moreover, he understood Jorg's character. Once he was determined to target someone, he would do everything to deal with that person. The first prince smiled and extended his hand to rub the third prince's face, telling him he believed he could do it. As for tonight's ball, currently it was a bit chaotic, so he would return there to handle it. He told the third prince to go rest first and leave this matter to him to handle. Yuri watched his older brother's back, thinking in his head if Bryle hadn't collapsed, then his older brother would have been the one ruling Bryle. He would have had the chance to witness Bryle becoming a strong kingdom under his older brother's reign. In this life, he would fight hard to be able to witness that with his own eyes, no matter who he had to face. The next morning, the match was held. Hernando was extremely excited, looking forward to the third prince's duel. He smiled, asking Captain Sane, sitting beside him, what he thought about this battle. He answered the opponent's spirit was very stable. He was very proficient in swordsmanship, even though he wasn't yet a knight. A person sitting beside also acknowledged that the Empire's royal guard was indeed very elite. Sane worried about whether the third prince would be okay, and caught the mage's smile, making him extremely curious. Hernando told the captain to quickly look at the third prince's relaxed demeanor. He thought he didn't need to worry. Grand Mage was a rank not everyone could achieve. In the hierarchy system for mages in the Magic Tower, it was only bestowed upon those who had comprehended primordial magic. Among those, the supreme type of magic that could glimpse the world's destiny was called fate-revealing magic. And in this world, only Hernando had reached that level. He had once played gambling with the third prince, but the result was a miserable defeat. He mocked, saying earlier he was acting all high and mighty, yet he couldn't even win a single round. Hernando knew this was the first time he had suffered a loss from a game, ever since obtaining primordial magic. At that time, he had asked himself if this was just a mere coincidence. But Hernando quickly rejected this thought because with just one glance, he could read his opponent's cards, even the flows of fortune. However, when standing before the third prince, he couldn't read anything at all. Instead, what he could see was an illusion of Sword Mountain. Hernando had witnessed with his own eyes a teenager with black hair and eyes bearing the symbol of the Bryle royal family, and an unmistakably arrogant gaze of the third prince. Even though the third prince's body was drenched in blood, he never stopped swinging his sword and never faltered. The illusion ended when Yuri collapsed in despair. Perhaps everything started from that moment. The story he once thought was random coincidence began revolving around a single point. However, after witnessing Prince Yuri's unusual actions during recent outings, Hernando was certain of that miracle. At this moment, he could affirm that fate-revealing magic could indeed be used. Based on his deductions, Hernando knew Prince Yuri was a person without fate. Yuri, standing on the arena, called out that he was ready. How long was the other side going to keep swinging swords in the air? Jorg asked if the third prince didn't need more time to prepare. Yuri then smiled, answering he could start any time. Fior, hearing both sides were ready, declared the judgment duel to begin. The moment the word begin was shouted, Yuri had charged toward his opponent almost instantly, creating pressure on his opponent. The king sitting beside Mage Hernando asked what he thought the result would be. The young mage smiled, answering he truly didn't know. The king brought up an old matter, saying he once said that his coming to Bryle was destined by heaven, right? Hearing his opponent answer yes, he continued asking if now was the time for him to leave, right? The king unexpectedly heard Hernando answer no. He was truly glad knowing he still hadn't left. Hernando expressed that the king had bestowed too much honor on a lowly mage like himself. He was truly grateful. Fior reminded the mage that being overly humble could bring disaster upon oneself. He also understood that according to the mage's meaning, nothing would happen. Hernando didn't answer and only asked the king who he felt was stronger between the two people on the arena. Fior answered with 2 words, opponents. He guessed the mage would say the same. He remembered the first day when he set foot in Bryle. It was entirely because of the guiding signs. It had shown him the person who could change the world's fate. The strongest person on the continent was here, but the sword had never been drawn. That was why Hernando once thought he had no reason to stay here. He spoke up, saying he once thought his time here had ended, but it seemed that moment hadn't arrived yet. Yuri on the arena sped up the pace of battle. He believed the time so far had been enough to probe everything. His opponent could sense the third prince was suddenly faster. He gritted his teeth, fighting back silently, thinking he was about to die. Everyone in the stands at this moment almost didn't dare to breathe, watching each movement of the two. Hernando exclaimed in disbelief that the third prince chose to turn his sword at the last moment to protect his opponent's life. He stood up abruptly, staring at the third prince on the arena, thinking he came here to find heavenly signs and then met someone who challenged it. Life transformed into death, and then death transformed back into life. At the tip of the third prince's sword, the fate bestowed upon that attendant had changed along with that young man. Each step the third prince took was now defiance against heaven's will. That's right, Yuri was the one who existed outside the fate of this world. Yuri Bryle, the one who transcended fate. Hernando cheered, saying, "You are truly extraordinary, prince." Honestly speaking, he was eager to witness how Yuri would change the fate of this world. Hernando's eyes sparkled with an extremely good mood. Here, where he had followed destiny, he had met someone who defied it. Normally, life would transform into death and life would bloom once again. However, at the tip of the third prince's sword, the fate bestowed upon that attendant and that boy had rewritten. Each step Yuri took defied the predetermined heavenly mandate. Hernando affirmed once more the one standing outside the world's fate was Yuri Bryle, the one who surpassed fate, the one who made people question how the third prince would reshape the world's fate. Hernando could notice he was extremely excited, waiting. 5 years later, a maid accidentally dropped something in front of one of the princes. Seeing who appeared was the second prince made the girl so frightened she couldn't speak. He uncomfortably approached, asking if she was new. The girl began re-identifying the person with black hair, the symbol of the Bryle royal family. The second prince angrily asked what the maid was doing here at this hour. The girl continuously told herself to stay calm. She needed to answer exactly as the seniors had taught. The second prince lost patience and shouted, asking again what she was doing here. The maid remembered if it was the person who always wore a bland expression, then it was His Majesty. As for the crown prince, he would always greet everyone with a gentle smile. So the person before her was definitely not that. Those eyes full of killing intent, and that swaying gait she temporarily couldn't remember. The second prince irritably called out, asking if she really wanted to ignore him. She bowed her head, guessing if perhaps he was the third prince. The second prince realized something and asked if they shared a code of conduct for dealing with the royal family. He asked further if it clearly stated to stay away from him. Seeing the girl only hemming and hawing made the second prince even angrier. He said alright, today, he would definitely teach these people a lesson. The third prince walked by, saving the girl from danger. He called out, "Brother, what were you planning to do this time?" The girl's head began calculating. The seniors had also mentioned one more person. If she saw someone with a confident expression, who also wore glasses on the side, then it was the third prince. Yuri smiled, looking at the two, asking if he was bullying the maid again. The matter was quickly handled satisfactorily by him. The maid thanked the third prince profusely, even offering the only pastry in her hand to him. Yuri put all the pastry in his mouth, remembering what just happened, and couldn't help but find it amusing. He brushed the crumbs from his mouth, thinking the food received from the maid was quite delicious. He dusted off his hands and accidentally created a flow of power. That was the state of formlessness, a state where even while holding a sword, the pressure on the hand was reduced through the use of mana. Yuri silently thought it seemed he had reached that state. 5 years had passed since he performed the regression after being killed under Lawrence's blade. Yuri whispered, saying it seemed his peaceful days were about to end. He guessed those people were probably chattering about all sorts of things right now. He knocked on the meeting room door, preparing to enter, but already heard arguing sounds coming from inside. Someone angrily scolded the group for ignoring what he said. Another scolded, saying he was the one not willing to listen. The soldier standing outside saw Yuri knock, but no one answered, so he spoke up, saying they were probably focused on the meeting so no one heard. He suggested the third prince could knock again, but before he could finish, the entire door was pushed down by him. Yuri looked at all the eyes turning toward him and apologized, because he knocked, but no one heard he used a bit too much force the second time. The soldier silently lamented, how could this be called knocking on a door? He was definitely going to be punished. Fior didn't know what to do with this child. He could only tell someone to prepare a chair to continue the meeting. The blonde-haired one still wouldn't compromise, saying anyway, there weren't enough soldiers to support the allies. Another noble shouted, asking if his meaning was to ignore the request from the empire. If so, then other nobles could accept on their behalf. What irresponsible words. Yuri sat listening for a while and saw that everyone was only thinking about their own gains and losses. Just like in his previous life, at exactly this time, an event had occurred in his life. It came from the call to join the alliance from the empire's side. They requested reinforcements from many nations and launched a large-scale attack against the ORCs toward the east. However, the alliance had failed, and in their rage, the ORCs frantically devastated, putting tremendous pressure on the borders of all participating nations. What Yuri remembered most clearly was everyone except the empire. It was then that he realized everything from the beginning had been arranged by the empire. And in that process, the kingdom lost outstanding knights who had joined the alliance, including Lan. But in this life, Yuri absolutely wouldn't let things flow in that direction anymore. Some nobles spoke up, saying anyway, the kingdom didn't need to send anyone there, and that was that. Seeing the group preparing to argue again, Yuri spoke up, telling them to stop. He would go. He would join the alliance, so each noble here should also show their sincerity. He emphasized to fulfill the duty of a noble so the Bryle name wouldn't be tarnished. Fior had no objection to his son's decision. He only thought so this was his son's decision. The second prince, hearing that his younger brother was personally joining the alliance, worriedly went to find him, asking why. The third prince was royalty and didn't need to personally do this. Yuri answered his older brother. He knew what he was going to say, right? It was the duty of royalty. The second prince smiled, saying all right. Today he finally understood his thinking. He told him to return safely. During that time, he would be the one protecting the palace. Yuri sighed, watching the second prince leave like a gust of wind. As long as he didn't cause more trouble, he would be relieved. He turned to ask Bernard if he wasn't going to worry about him. He calmly answered as long as he didn't act recklessly, then he was certain he would return safely. Yuri thanked his generous assessment. Bernard revealed a hint of worry, reminding him to be careful no matter what. ORCs weren't easy to deal with. They were much stronger and more detestable than he imagined. Especially be careful of the ORCs with flags on their backs. They were called ORCVAL. These ones were especially fierce and stronger than their kind. Yuri told him not to worry, he had his own method. Bernard curiously asked if he had another plan. Just then Anna hurriedly ran in, reporting that a guest had arrived bringing the item he needed. The third prince smiled, answering that of course he had a plan, a very special plan. The person bringing items to the third prince was the vice president of Elaine's merchant guild, Mr. Guillermo. He informed that currently Elaine was on the road, so he came on her behalf. Yuri asked if she was still traveling everywhere herself. If possible, tell her to travel less. The vice president answered she said that was what she did best. The third prince ended the pleasantries and got straight to the point, asking if he came here today just for that. Guillermo laughed loudly, saying of course not. Today he brought the third prince the item he had mentioned last time. Yuri opened the box and looked inside, praising that he did well. The sparkling knives inside were elementarian. The vice president asked if these things were that valuable, because in his eyes they were just display daggers. Yuri answered very valuable. They were artifacts containing ancient magic. Guillermo was startled when he saw the knife moving on its own. The third prince laughed loudly, saying it was fine, he wouldn't die. He was amazed that the prince was controlling it. He didn't think he was this strong. Magic could even be used to control objects. Yuri asked back if he thought he just lazed around all day. Ending today's meeting, Yuri reminded his counterpart to pass his regards to Elaine anyway, and next time report to him the preparation status of the branch in the empire. Guillermo answered of course. Finishing his task, he quickly left. The previous person had just left when the next arrived. Asana appeared silently behind the third prince. She reported regarding Goryo's matter. She had sent him a warning on his behalf. Seeing it wasn't enough, she spoke in more detail, using a knife to pin a message right above his head while he slept. Yuri praised her for doing well. That old man still wouldn't stop targeting Elaine's money. Asana had heard from a servant that the third prince intended to join the alliance and asked if it was true. Hearing confirmation from him, she simply said to be careful. Yuri wasn't satisfied, saying she spoke as if he was going alone. Anyway, she would be going too. Asana smiled, answering anywhere was fine, all better than where she used to be. Having finished reporting, she too, like the vice president, quickly disappeared. If anything came up, she would contact him later. The day Yuri would return to the battlefield quickly arrived. The first prince came to see his younger brother off. He wished him to take care. Yuri smiled, telling his older brother not to worry. He was undefeated and would bring glory to the Bryle house. He teased his older brother back, saying when studying he should also take breaks, remember to take care of his eyes. The first prince embraced his younger brother, saying farewell. He promised his older brother he would definitely return. Fior declared the ceremony to proceed. Yuri, being the main figure, stepped up beside him. The king looked straight into his son's eyes, asking if he was nervous. Yuri confidently answered not at all. He then told him to quickly look behind. All the soldiers he saw here were all precious lives he had to carry on his shoulders. Yuri silently thought not all could survive and return. However, he would ensure they wouldn't suffer a tragic death like in his previous life. The king asked his son one final time was he sure he could do it. Then try to endure this. Around Yuri, it began to darken. His body began unable to move. Instinct told him that what was approaching closer was death. If he tried to avoid it, he would die, but couldn't he refuse it? Yuri picked up his sword and answered himself yes, he definitely could. In that unexpected downward slash, Fior's face appeared, praising him, saying well done. He let Yuri know this was the substitute for a farewell letter. The king said he wouldn't be long-winded, strive to survive and return. Yuri accepted his father's words. He stepped up, standing before the soldiers, loudly letting them know he was the third prince of Bryle, Yuri Bryle. He called on everyone to place their trust in him. All forces move out.